Hi, my name's not important. But the fact that I gave 12 years of my life, saved my family's company millions, and still got laughed at by my own father, that is. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Anyone can replace you. Go learn from your brother." That was the day I stopped being a son and became a liability. One phone call later, my salary tripled. Weeks after that, the company collapsed. And when the truth surfaced, the man who once told me I was replaceable knelt down in front of me and begged. But by then, it was already too late. Pause. You ever wonder what happens when the quiet one finally walks away? I didn't walk into my father's office nervous. I walked in tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep, but from years of holding your posture straight while something inside you slowly bends. The hallway outside his office looked the same as it always had. Framed photos of company milestones, a plaque from a local business journal, a family portrait from a holiday party years ago when we still pretended work never followed us home. I knocked once. He told me to come in without looking up. 12 years. That's what I had given this place. I didn't rehearse numbers in my head anymore. I already knew them. The late nights, the weekends, the calls that came during birthdays and school events. I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to demand. I was here to ask for fairness, the way a grown man does when he believes his work has earned him that right. I sat across from him, folding my hands loosely in my lap. He finally looked up, glasses sliding down his nose, expression neutral. Familiar, too familiar. "I wanted to talk about my compensation," I said. Calm, measured, no edge in my voice. "Given the scope of my responsibilities now, I think a 20% adjustment is reasonable." I let the words settle between us. For a split second, I thought he might actually consider it. His eyes didn't harden. He didn't interrupt. He leaned back in his chair, fingers resting on the armrests, as if we were discussing something casual, the weather, a lunch plan. Then he laughed, not loud, not sharp. Just a short sound, clipped and effortless, like a reflex, like the answer had been obvious all along. That laugh landed harder than a shout would have. He didn't rush to fill the space afterward. The silence stretched. It pressed against my chest, tight and heavy. I waited for him to explain, to soften it, to say something that turned it into a misunderstanding. Instead, he said, "Anyone can replace you." Just that, flat, certain. I felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted under my feet. I kept my face still. Years of experience had taught me how to do that, how to keep your reaction from becoming ammunition. He continued, already moving on in his mind. "You know what your problem is?" He gestured vaguely toward the other side of the office, where the wall separated his space from the rest of the building. "You should go learn from your brother." There it was. Not no. Not yet. Comparison. That cut deeper than rejection ever could. My brother's name didn't need to be said. It lived in every meeting, every praise-filled email, every story told at family gatherings. His department, his role, his supposed instincts, the golden standard I was always measured against, no matter how much I fixed quietly behind the scenes. I thought of the projects I'd stepped into when no one wanted their name attached, the late evenings when the parking lot was empty except for my car, the dinners I missed while everyone else clinked glasses without me. None of that came out of my mouth. I swallowed it. He leaned forward slightly now, elbows on the desk, voice still even. "If you're really that good," he said, "try your luck somewhere else." That sentence changed everything. It wasn't advice. It wasn't encouragement. It was a door being closed, politely, while someone held it just long enough to make sure you understood you weren't welcome on the other side. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of anything I had done. I noticed his pen instead. The same pen he used to sign contracts, approvals, decisions that shaped people's lives. He picked it up, glanced down at a document, and began writing while I was still sitting there. His attention moved away from me as if I had already left. That's when I understood something important. This conversation hadn't started when I knocked. It had been settled long before I took that chair. I stood up quietly. The chair legs made a soft sound against the floor, and for a moment I wondered if that would make him look up again. It didn't. I walked out the way I came in, past the photos, past the plaque, past the portrait that no longer felt like proof of belonging. By the time I reached the hallway, my hands were steady. My chest felt hollow, but clear. I walked out of my father's office knowing something had broken, but I didn't yet understand what it would cost him. The elevator ride down felt too short, like my body hadn't caught up to what had just happened. When the doors opened, I stepped onto the executive floor and kept walking, past glass offices and familiar corners where people worked with quiet focus. A few heads lifted. Polite nods followed. Nothing unusual to them. To anyone watching, I was just another manager finishing a long day. Inside, something felt off-center. I passed the conference room where I'd once stayed until midnight, fixing a mess no one wanted traced back to them. I passed the break area where a younger analyst had once thanked me for explaining something no one else had time for. I had helped build systems here, clean ones, reliable ones. But standing there, I understood the difference between building something and belonging to it. I belonged to the work, not to the future. By the time I reached the parking garage, the late afternoon light had softened into a dull gray. I sat in my car for a moment before turning the key. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, calm, not angry yet, just displaced like furniture moved without warning. As I pulled onto the road, my father's words returned, uninvited and clear. Try your luck somewhere else. At first, it sounded almost generous, like advice you'd give a stranger. Then it settled into its real meaning. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't impatience. It was permission to erase me from the picture without having to explain why. At a stoplight, I glanced at my phone. No message, no follow-up, no let's talk later. The screen stayed dark. That silence said more than any argument could have. The drive home blurred into routine. Traffic. A radio host talking about nothing important. I ate something simple that evening without tasting it. I slept lightly, waking once before dawn with the same sentence echoing in my head, already stripped of emotion and sharp with clarity. Sunday came faster than I expected. By early evening, I was pulling into my parents' driveway, the house looking exactly as it always had. Same trimmed hedges, same porch light, same sense that time behaved differently here, looping instead of moving forward. Inside, the smell of dinner wrapped around me. My mother greeted me warmly, as she always did, asking about my week without waiting for details. I took my usual seat at the table, across from my father. Or at least, I started to. My brother was already sitting closer to him than usual. Not my chair, my father's side. No one announced it. No one explained. It was presented as coincidence, which made it sharper. Plates were passed. Small talk flowed. Someone mentioned the weather. Another comment about how busy things had been at the company. Then the words shifted. The future, my father said casually, cutting his food. Leadership, my brother added, nodding. Continuity, my mother said softly, as if it were a comfort. They spoke, around me, never to me. No one used my name. This wasn't an accident. This was rehearsal. I watched the chair more than the people. How naturally my brother leaned in. How my father angled his body toward him when speaking. The placement said everything words didn't need to. This was how it would look when it mattered. At one point, my father mentioned a long-term plan. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on my brother, steady and approving. That's when it landed. I hadn't been passed over last week. I hadn't been passed over that afternoon. I had been passed over years ago. The office conversation wasn't a decision. It was confirmation. I finished my meal without comment. I thanked my mother. I excused myself early, citing work, which drew a knowing look from my brother and a neutral one from my father. No one stopped me. In the car, alone, the weight finally settled where it belonged. I wasn't fighting for a raise anymore. I was fighting for my name. That night, I started replaying every sacrifice I'd ever made, and for the first time, I asked myself who they were really for. I lay there with my eyes open, the ceiling fan spinning in slow rhythm above me, my mind flicking through old scenes like files I hadn't meant to reopen. Not memories, really. More like records, each one a project, a deadline, a decision. At some point during the night, I stopped trying to rest and just got up. I sat in my home office with a legal pad and pen, no agenda except to write. What came out wasn't emotional. It was precise. Names, dates, what went wrong, what I did to fix it. Not because I planned to show anyone, not yet. I just needed to see it all in one place. Looking back, I wasn't angry. I was auditing. 12 years is a long time to stay silent. Long enough to forget which wins were yours and which were handed upward like gifts for someone else to unwrap. I remembered one crisis in particular. Our logistics software had failed mid-quarter, threatening to delay hundreds of shipments. The vendor blamed our team. The team blamed the vendor. While they pointed fingers, I stayed after hours for 3 days rebuilding the flow in Excel, manually patching every hole. The system held, the quarter closed strong, and at the next meeting, the solution was summarized as a collaborative save. No names attached, certainly not mine. That pattern had never struck me as strange until now. Monday morning, I returned to the office, same parking space, same elevator ride. The building hadn't changed, but I had. The tension I felt wasn't about whether I belonged. It was about how long I'd let myself think I did. Around mid-morning, I opened an internal folder I had used for years to archive department-wide communications. A quarterly presentation slid open on my screen. One slide stopped me cold. A chart showing a major cost-saving initiative from 2 years ago, one I had led from scratch. I remembered every line of code in the model. I had built it at night, after the kids were asleep, tweaking it until the projections held up against real conditions. The slide called it Operational Streamlining Initiative. Bullet points listed the outcomes. A brief line at the bottom, led by cross-functional leadership under senior guidance. That was it. No name, no mention. Nothing tying it to me. I leaned back in my chair. That wasn't an oversight. That was the language of erasure. As the hours passed, I saw it everywhere. Meeting minutes where I had pitched strategy, but the final version had someone else's voice stamped on it. Emails I wrote, sent upward, only to come back down as someone else's policy. Praise that never traveled downward. Promotions that landed in the laps of people I'd trained to navigate problems I had already solved. And the realization hit hard. I hadn't been excluded once. I had been excluded by design. The company didn't forget me. It used me. I was the silent support beam, always holding weight, but never spotlighted. I had authority when something needed to be fixed, but none when it came time for credit. A title without title. Influence without insulation. That's not how healthy systems work. That's how control works. It was never about effort. It was about structure. I remembered sitting in meetings with my father and brother where ideas were floated like balloons. I'd offer clear answers, actionable plans. My father would nod, not at me, but at my brother. Later that week, I'd see those plans sent company-wide, with edits, of course, to reframe them. No thanks. No trace. Just disappearance. That night, back at my desk, I didn't write a resignation letter. I didn't polish a resume. I opened a blank spreadsheet and started listing it all. Emails, project names, deadlines, handovers, slides where my work had been stripped of signature. I didn't do it to retaliate. I did it because I needed to remember who I had been before I was told not to be visible. I needed to see the full picture before someone else redrew the frame. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about what silence had cost me. Realization stayed with me all week. I'd show up to work, handle what needed handling, but something inside had shifted. I didn't volunteer ideas anymore. I didn't speak unless spoken to. And when Friday came, I didn't feel that quiet anticipation I used to feel heading into the weekend, not even for Sunday dinner. Still, I went. I always did. Sunday night came like it always did, wrapped in the same Midwest chill that hinted at fall, the same stretch of two-lane road leading to my parents' place. The porch light was on. It always was. Habit ran deep in that house, right down to the creak in the third step and the faint smell of rosemary from Mom's roast chicken. I rang the bell, even though I never had to. Mom opened the door with that warm, practiced smile. Her hug felt softer than usual, polite, not maternal. I followed her into the kitchen, where everything looked like it had for 20 years. The same wooden table, the same over-polished silverware. A few new pictures on the wall, mostly of my brother's kids. The dining room buzzed like any normal family meal. Glasses clinking, plates being set. My brother already seated with his wife and their two daughters, talking about their school fundraiser. Dad sat at the head, of course. No one said it. But that seat was understood. Except this time, it wasn't mine to sit anywhere near him. My usual spot across from him was taken by my brother. It looked casual. A napkin folded neatly by his plate. His sleeves rolled up like he belonged there. No one mentioned the switch. No one had to. I took the next open seat, beside Mom. She didn't meet my eyes as she passed me a basket of rolls. The conversation moved like a current I couldn't quite step into. My brother was talking about stability and direction, phrases he had picked up from boardroom briefings. Dad nodded, chewing quietly. My sister-in-law added something about preserving legacy, and everyone chuckled, except me. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked if I was still working on the marketing overhaul I'd started 3 quarters ago, back when I still had access to that data. The meal went on like a play I wasn't cast in. Forks moved, glasses lifted, jokes told. At one point, Dad looked directly at my brother and said, "I think your instincts have really sharpened this year. You're seeing the bigger picture." That sentence was meant to sound casual, but it carried the weight of ceremony, a nod of succession. My brother nodded like he'd heard it before. I stared down at my plate, cutting the same piece of chicken twice. The silence that circled me wasn't loud, but it was thick. Even when Mom asked if someone wanted more salad, she skipped me. And then Dad leaned back, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and said something that sounded soft but cut like a blade. I know things have felt a little tense, but this is still a family. Let's not confuse roles with relationships. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. I understood. Loud and clear. This wasn't personal, he was saying. This was structure, hierarchy, family and business. Two separate lanes. And I was drifting where I didn't belong. My brother nodded, reaching for more wine like it was a toast. I sat still. My knuckles were white around the fork, but I kept my voice quiet. I wanted to scream, to remind them that I had been the one pulling night shifts when we nearly lost the Miller contract, that I had bailed out the logistics team when their system crashed, that every report my brother had ever delivered to the boardroom had been built from my notes. But I didn't, because that would have made me look emotional. And that's what they were counting on. Then came the line that sealed it all. Dad said, "If you're unhappy, son, no one's forcing you to stay." He said it kindly, gently even. But that sentence broke something clean. I had spent years waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for a raise, for recognition. For my father to finally say, "I see what you've done." And in one sentence, he made it clear. He never would, because to him, I was never me. I was a placeholder, a support beam, quiet labor, not a leader. What stunned me wasn't that he said it. It was how free I felt hearing it. I looked up, not at him, but at Mom. She met my eyes this time, and for just a second I saw regret, not for what was said, but maybe for what hadn't been. I set my fork down gently, pushed back from the table, stood up with both hands on the edge of the chair to steady myself. "Thanks for dinner, Mom," I said. "I've got an early morning." Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked where I was going. I walked to the front door, taking my coat off the hook like I had 100 Sundays before. Out in the driveway, I sat behind the wheel for a long minute before starting the engine. The house looked smaller in my rearview mirror. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was abandoning something. I felt like I was finally breathing. Outside was crisp when I pulled out of my parents' driveway that Sunday night, but it wasn't the wind that chilled me. It was the weightless feeling in my chest. Not fear, not regret. Something closer to the calm that comes after a storm, when the wreckage is still all around you, but the rain has finally stopped. The days that followed passed like background noise. I went through the motions, emails, meetings, reports. But my mind wasn't there. Something had shifted after that dinner. Something permanent, like a gear that had slipped loose and couldn't be forced back into place. Wednesday night, the house was quiet. My wife and son had gone to bed early. A leftover lasagna dish still sat on the counter, half covered in foil. I washed it slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wasn't ready to sit down yet. Eventually, I did. At the small desk in the corner of the guest room I'd converted into my office years ago, I opened my laptop but didn't touch the keyboard. My phone lay face up beside me. No calls missed, no texts from my father, no follow-up from anyone at the office. They were moving on, cleanly, silently, and I was still here, trying to decide whether I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life, or finally do the one thing I should have done years ago. I stared at the screen. There was a name I hadn't looked at in a long time. Not family, not a friend, Just a contact I'd saved after a conference in Dallas 7 years ago. We'd talked shop over bad hotel coffee. I barely remembered what company he was with now, but I remembered what he'd said, almost in passing, while we waited for our rides. "If you ever want to be seen," he'd said, "call me." At the time, I laughed it off. I had a future where I was, a path, a family name. But now all I had was silence and a title that meant less than the pen used to print it. I picked up the phone, then set it down, then picked it up again. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring at water I wasn't sure I could swim in. I don't know how long I sat like that. Eventually, I tapped his name. The line rang once, twice. He answered. "Hello?" It took me a second to find my voice. "Hey, it's Daniel. Daniel Mason." A pause. Then warmly, "Didn't expect this call, but I hoped one day you'd make it." That small sentence, that one gesture of respect, hit harder than it should have. We talked. Short, direct. He didn't ask why I was calling. He didn't fish for gossip. He just listened. Let me lay out my history, my skills, my frustrations. I told him about the systems I'd built, the results I'd delivered, not with pride, but with clarity. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he said, "What you've done, we'd value. What you've become, we'd protect." Then he told me the role, the scope, the freedom. And then he said the number. I didn't speak for a moment. Not because it shocked me. It didn't. I'd done the math years ago. I knew what I was worth. But hearing it confirmed by someone outside the family, that stung. I thanked him, told him I needed the night to think. "Take the time you need," he said. "But know this, we don't need convincing." I ended the call and sat in the dark. No smile, no celebration, just grief. Grief for the years I spent accepting crumbs, telling myself it was enough because it came from my father's hand, because it came from a place I thought I had to earn, not knowing I'd already paid the price in full, over and over again. The next morning, before the sun was up, I was at my desk again. I opened a blank document and started typing. "Dear Mr. Mason, effective next month, I hereby resign from my position." I kept it clean. No accusations, no bitterness, just the facts. A thank you for the experience. A line about new opportunities aligned with personal growth. I read it twice, printed it once. And as the page slid out of the tray, I heard his voice in my head again. My father's voice. "If you're really that good, try your luck somewhere else." For the first time, I realized something. I wasn't breaking a rule. I was following his instructions. He just never thought I'd take them seriously. And now that I had, he'd have to learn what it felt like when the piece he thought was fixed to the board decided to move. Nation on a Monday morning. No dramatic send-off, no hallway whispers. Just a printed page, folded once, delivered by hand. My father barely glanced at it before sliding it aside on his desk. He didn't say much, only nodded and said, "You'll finish the 2 weeks properly, I assume?" I told him I would, and I meant it, because walking away didn't mean walking dirty. Over the next days, I did the kind of exit most people don't bother with. I cleaned up the shared drives. I organized handoff files. I wrote documentation so detailed that even a junior analyst could follow the logic and not lose track. I didn't check out. I made sure no one could say I left a mess behind. Quietly, meticulously, I tied up the loose ends I had once been paid to notice when no one else did. It wasn't pride. It was insurance. If anything failed after I walked out, I wanted to be able to sleep at night. The office itself started treating me like a ghost. People were polite, but different, like I'd already been erased from the roster. Even the folks who used to greet me in the kitchen started taking their coffee elsewhere when I walked in. That Wednesday, I sat in on my last leadership update. Weekly, standing room meetings, mostly filled with familiar voices echoing familiar plans. But this time, it wasn't familiar. This time, I watched it like an outsider. Halfway through, someone, Gregory from finance, leaned back in his chair and said, "We've got it covered." No urgency, no concern, just blanket confidence like he'd memorized it from a team-building retreat. The whole room nodded, even my father. No one looked my way. That phrase, "We've got it covered," landed heavier than it sounded. They didn't just believe they were prepared. They believed I'd never really mattered. I waited until after the meeting. Back at my desk, I reviewed the system again, the one I'd spent 18 months overhauling after the supply chain failure 2 winters ago. The one I rebuilt when our vendor almost bankrupted us because no one caught the missing compliance clause in their contracts. There was a soft spot. Not a failure point yet, but something that could buckle under seasonal pressure. A third-party dependency that wasn't flagged correctly. It was subtle, technical, easy to ignore unless you knew how it fit into the larger pattern. I drafted one last email. Clear, detailed, no emotion. Subject, vendor oversight. Q4 monitoring suggestion. I walked through the logic. I listed the risk. I attached the supporting documentation. I didn't blame anyone. I didn't make it sound urgent. I didn't dramatize. I just offered it like a weather report. Facts, not warnings. It went to my father, Gregory, the operations lead. And out of habit, I CC'd myself on my personal email. The reply came the next day. Short, formal, clean. "Thanks, we've got it covered." That's when it hit me. They didn't want protection. They wanted autonomy. Or more accurately, the look of autonomy. They didn't want risk management. They wanted the illusion of mastery. That email told me more than any meeting had. It wasn't just that they thought I was replaceable. It was that they wanted to prove it. The next few days moved fast. I stopped offering suggestions, stopped double-checking the backups, stopped pointing out the soft code that had never been updated after the team restructure. I showed up. I was respectful. I smiled when I needed to. I trained the person they picked to absorb my functions, a young guy named Max, bright enough but barely seasoned. He didn't ask many questions. Maybe he thought asking would make him look unsure. Maybe he was told not to. Friday afternoon, I cleaned out my desk. No ceremony, no farewell cake. Just a cardboard box and a half-used notebook I hadn't touched since July. That evening, I stepped into my new office. Smaller, quieter, but sharper somehow. The energy wasn't legacy. It was forward. People introduced themselves, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. One of the partners stopped by with a bottle of sparkling cider and said, "We're glad you're here. Take your time settling in, but when you're ready, we've got real things to build." Real things. Not reputation, not dynasty. Actual value. But even as I stood there, smiling and nodding, part of me stayed tuned to something else, because I knew what they didn't. Back at the firm, my father's firm, there was a flaw still ticking beneath the surface, and when it went off, it wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't break politely. It would snap loud enough for everyone to hear. And when it did, they'd go looking for a name to blame, and mine wouldn't be there. I was still in bed, half dreaming about a spreadsheet that refused to balance, when the phone buzzed against my nightstand. I reached over blindly, squinting at the name on the screen. It was Dana, one of the few people at the old firm I still respected. I answered with a groggy, "Hey, what's going on?" There was a pause, then her voice, low and tight. "Have you seen the news?" I sat up. "No. Why?" "You might want to check your email and maybe don't go on LinkedIn yet." She hung up before I could ask anything else. Still in my sweatpants, I padded down the hallway and into my home office. The house was quiet, my wife still asleep, coffee not yet brewed. I opened the laptop, waited for the screen to load, and clicked through to my inbox. Subject line: Internal communication regarding system disruption, confidential. I opened it. I read it. Then I read it again. It didn't say my name directly, but it didn't have to. There were phrases like legacy system vulnerabilities and structural decisions made prior to transition, a bulleted list of issues, each of which I had flagged, documented, and communicated before leaving. One item was even lifted verbatim from the email I'd sent during my final week. And then, nestled toward the end, unfortunately, while the departure of certain personnel was conducted professionally, it left us unaware of critical dependencies. It was a master class in implication. I wasn't just the guy who'd left. I was now the reason something had failed. My chest tightened, not with guilt, but with rage. A few minutes later, a colleague at my new firm knocked gently on my door with a coffee. "Morning," she said. "Rough start?" I forced a smile and took the cup. "Something like that." I didn't speak of it during the morning meetings. I got through my tasks, checked off my follow-ups, and stayed composed. But the background noise was building. A whisper here, a tag and a comment there. By noon, I'd already been mentioned in 2 industry Slack threads. One hinted I'd left the firm in chaos. Another used the phrase convenient timing. They were planting the idea that I'd set them up to fail. And once that idea took root, it spread faster than anything else. I didn't call my father. I didn't expect to hear from him either. If he was behind the memo or had even allowed it to go out, then he'd already made his choice. Not a call, not a warning. Just a press release disguised as internal communication. I checked the timestamp on the email. It had gone out at 5:52 a.m., before the workday started, just in time to set the tone for the day. By 3 in the afternoon, someone from my previous firm had reached out to clarify that the message wasn't intended as an accusation, just context. That word, context, burned hotter than any insult. I stared at the email, my hand hovering over the keyboard. I could have replied right then, posted screenshots, published my resignation letter, forwarded the thread where I had documented the very issue now unraveling their operations. But I didn't. Instead, I opened a folder I'd started months earlier, titled simply Truth. Inside were time-stamped copies of every warning I'd ever given. Memos, process outlines, documentation logs with the original dates embedded. I copied them to an encrypted drive. Then I made a call. Not to a journalist, not to a tech blog, to a lawyer. He answered on the 3rd ring. Calm voice. Asked no unnecessary questions. I explained the situation. He didn't sound surprised. "This happens more than you'd think," he said. "But most folks don't prepare the way you have." He asked if I'd be willing to respond publicly. I told him no, not yet. "Good," he said. "We'll do this carefully." As I ended the call, I leaned back in my chair. I'd expected silence after leaving. I hadn't expected sabotage. But even as the noise grew louder, something inside me quieted. Because for the first time, I wasn't scrambling. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't bracing for the blow. I had prepared for this, and they had no idea what that would cost them. I didn't need to lift a finger. The first tremor didn't come from me. It came from outside. A compliance partner at one of their insurance firms flagged a discrepancy in the internal handling of the failure. Then a vendor quietly pulled out of a pending renewal, citing concerns about leadership transparency. Within days, an external audit was announced, not requested. Announced. It was no longer their game. The rules they made didn't apply when real money was involved, when investors and outside stakeholders stepped in. By Thursday morning, I was sitting across from two attorneys in a downtown office with glass walls and a view that stretched for miles. One of them was with my legal counsel. The other, hired by the board of the old firm, now tasked with conducting an independent review. They didn't ask me to justify myself. They asked for records. I slid a drive across the table, labeled, time-stamped, indexed. Start with the email sent 3 days before my resignation, I said quietly. That's where they chose silence. The woman beside me, sharp suit, graying hair, minimal makeup, glanced at the screen as files loaded. Then she looked back at me. You were careful. I had to be, I said. Careful wasn't pride. It was survival. The next few days were a blur of briefings and conference calls. Most of them didn't involve me directly. I wasn't the accused anymore. I was the point of reference, the breadcrumb trail. One by one, the pieces began to fall into place. My name, previously whispered in accusation, now came up in legal memos as a source of early risk disclosure. The same executives who had nodded smugly in that meeting, the ones who told the staff, "We've got it covered," were now being asked to explain why they hadn't acted on documented vulnerabilities. And the phrase that kept showing up in the auditor's language? Negligent oversight. Not mine. Theirs. By the end of the week, I received a calendar invite from a name I hadn't seen in weeks. My father. No title. No assistant copied. Just a time and a place. A private club on the outskirts of town, quiet and away from corporate eyes. The room smelled of old wood and silent regrets. He was already seated when I arrived. Not in his usual power pose. Not at the head of a boardroom table. Just seated. One leg crossed over the other, hands resting on his lap. For the first time in a long time, he looked like a man, not a symbol. And the man looked tired. "Thanks for coming," he said, eyes not quite meeting mine. I sat down. I didn't speak first. I'd learned. There was a pause that stretched into something heavier. Then he leaned forward. "I underestimated how much you documented." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't deflection either. I gave a small nod. "You assumed I'd stay silent. I thought you'd want to protect the family name." I didn't flinch. "I did. That's why I spoke when it counted." He took that in, didn't argue. Another pause. Then he exhaled slowly and looked out the window. "The company's in trouble," he said finally. More than I expected. I waited. "We've lost a contract. The audit report is going to make waves. And the board, well, let's just say some of them are questioning decisions." He turned back to me, and this time he looked at me as a father might, not as a man desperate to salvage power. "I want to ask you to come back," he said. "Not formally, not right away. Just help stabilize things. Help me fix what's left." He didn't plead, but he bent, not in words, in posture, in presence. The man who once towered over every meeting now looked smaller. Not broken, but different. And me? I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something heavier. Something older than all the arguments we'd had. I saw in that moment a man who had spent his life building an empire without ever asking whether the foundation was solid. And now that it cracked, he turned, not to his team, not to his lawyers, but to the son he'd tried to silence. I could have said yes. I could have used the moment as leverage, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned back and looked him in the eye. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "But I'm also not the person who sacrifices himself just to keep your story intact." He looked down. No argument came. Just a quiet, barely audible, "I know." We sat in silence for a long time. Two men, a father and son, a failed system between us. Outside, the leaves had started to fall. The air was crisp, but not cold. Change was coming. I stood up first. "I hope the company survives," I said, "but it won't be because I came back to save it." He didn't rise right away. He stayed seated, eyes fixed on something far beyond the window. As I walked out, I realized something with final clarity. He hadn't really called me there to ask for help. He'd called me to surrender, quietly, privately, before the world forced him to do it publicly. And that was a chapter I never expected to write. Driving home after that meeting, I didn't turn the radio on. I didn't call anyone. I just listened to the hum of the engine, the faint tapping of my turn signal, the sound of my own breath slowing down as the weight of years finally began to lift. Not with triumph, but with finality. 3 days later, I received another message from my father. It wasn't dramatic. No bold subject line, no legal attachment. Just one sentence. "Let's make this official. Equity, seat at the table, your name on the next charter." Everything I used to want. All the years I spent proving myself, hoping for recognition, hoping he'd finally say, "You've earned it." And now, when the dust had settled, and the truth had done what the truth always eventually does, resurface, he was ready to offer it all. But time changes the value of things. What would have felt like validation a year ago now felt hollow. I stared at the message, letting the cursor hover over reply, then leaned back in my chair. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't bait. He was genuinely trying to fix something, but it wasn't about me. It was about holding together what he still could, about shoring up what remained of his legacy. And I had no interest in trading my peace for a seat in a collapsing castle. That evening, I walked through the door just after 7. The lights were low in the kitchen, a pot still warm on the stove. My daughter was curled up on the couch with a book, my wife putting away laundry upstairs. No one asked me what I was going to do. They didn't need to. I poured myself a cup of coffee, yes, coffee at night, and sat at the dining table, letting the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. What would it take to go back? Silence again. Deference again. The constant calculus of when to speak and when to swallow. And beneath all that, the expectation that I'd be grateful just to be tolerated. I thought of the years I'd put in. Not just the hours, but the years of identity, loyalty, and blind faith. I thought of the nights I'd driven home wondering if I was crazy for thinking I deserved better. And I realized something simple and sobering. I hadn't been wrong. I'd just been outnumbered. So I clicked reply, typed only 2 sentences, and hit send. I appreciate the offer, but I'm choosing not to return. No bitterness, no elaboration, no open door. Just a boundary. The next morning, I got up before dawn, not because I had to, but because my body had settled into a new rhythm. I made coffee, grabbed my notepad, and went out to the porch as the sky began to shift from indigo to pale blue. There's something honest about the early morning. Nothing postured, nothing filtered. Just breath and light and thought. I started writing, not for anyone, not for work, just for me. Notes about projects I wanted to lead. Ideas about how to build the kind of environment I never had. I wasn't rebuilding the past. I was designing something else entirely. At work, things felt clean. Not perfect, but grounded. People asked questions. They took feedback without seeing it as threat. I wasn't the smartest person in the room, and that was a relief. And slowly, without fanfare or announcement, I started noticing the way people turned toward me when decisions were being made. Not because of a last name, not because of a title passed down, but because I'd proven myself with consistency, not bloodlines. One afternoon, a junior colleague knocked on my door. She looked nervous. I just wanted to say, "I read the story in the industry journal," she said. "What happened to you? That shouldn't happen to anyone. And the way you handled it, quiet, dignified, it taught me something. So thank you." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and said, "That means more than you know." She left the office, and I sat there a long time. I didn't need vindication anymore. But I wasn't immune to being seen. There was no parade, no article calling me the hero. Just small things. A call from a former vendor asking to work with me again. A handwritten note from a former intern who said I was the only one who ever remembered her name. An invitation to speak at a leadership forum, not about success, but about integrity. And each one, quiet as it was, felt like a brick in the road back to myself. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was finally, truly done. This is what I walked away with. Not a title, not a company, not a fight. I walked away with my own voice, intact. I walked away with the knowledge that boundaries don't make you weak. They mark where your value begins. I walked away with a family that doesn't flinch when I walk through the door. And maybe most importantly, I walked away without becoming what I was fighting. They told me anyone could replace me. What they never considered was that I might replace the version of myself who believed them.